Author Andre Dubus's new memoir, Townie, reads like the story of a young man destined to end up in prison, not on the New York Times bestseller list. Dubus grew up in Haverhill during the mid-1970s, and in his book, he looks back at a boy enraged by the bullying, crime, and poverty surrounding him. He turned to fighting and violence, but later to writing, which gave him both a positive outlet and a chance to reconnect with his father, Andre Dubus II, also an acclaimed author. Raw and painfully honest, Townie is now in bookstores, and Andre Dubus is here. Welcome, Andre.
Thanks for having me, Emily.
This is wow. You can't open a newspaper these days without reading some rave review about this book. You got to feel relieved.
Thank God, yeah. Yeah, you always feel like you dodge a bullet when the review is good, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's something about it, though. You get into it, it's raw and unrelenting. That's the opening story about reconnecting with your father very briefly after he had already left the home, and you're scrounging around the house trying to find a pair of sneakers, and you finally grab this pair of sneakers that belong to your sister, and then you go on what ends up being like a 15-mile run. You think it's going to be a little jog, but you didn't want to tell him in what agony you were in.
No, I mean, my parents were divorced in the 70s, and, as you know, if you're poor already as a family, divorce will make you poorer if there's still one income. Now it has to provide for two households, and my dad, he wasn't a deadbeat dad. I mean, he gave us half his income, and he was poor too, but it was not ever enough for my mother to take care of the four kids. And yeah, so on that one day, I went for a run with him, and I put on my sister's shoes, and they were a size too small and already worn down, and we ended up running 11 miles, and I never told him because I didn't want to get mad at my mother, which is not uncommon.
You said your toes were split open like sausages.
Yeah.
There's a heartbreaking line in there which is just so true. I mean, there's a lot of heartbreaking stuff, but when you said, with a divorce comes the separation of friends, and friends abandon your mother.
Yeah, I was shocked by that because my mother is, to this day, a very charismatic and beautiful woman. Yeah, the friends seemed to either go with the father or the mother, and they all went with the charismatic writer. And so she was left high and dry. And also writing this book, Emily, I was really made aware through the writing that how little support she had in any way, because all of their families were from Louisiana. So they were on this little island, this little nuclear family in New England. When they split up, there was nobody to help. No aunt, no uncle, no cousin, no grandparent. And the friends left with him. So she was really left alone with four kids. And, she went back to school. She got work as a nurse's aide, then a waitress. Then she went to Radcliffe and got a bachelor's degree, and she became a social worker. But, she never made any money, the way social workers don't, sadly. And it meant a childhood where we moved quite a bit for cheaper rent. And I found myself in some tough neighborhoods getting beat up fairly regularly.
I mean, you all had a tough childhood. I mean, you described one of your sisters, Nicole, who just kind of padlocked herself behind a door. Another sister who, trolled around the projects and eventually ended up getting gang raped. Your younger brother, who ended up with an older woman, slightly older, and tried to kill himself at one point. I mean, did it become almost the norm?
Well, I'm so glad you asked it that way, Emily. I think, It was what I knew. I mean, my best friend's mother was in the depths of alcoholism, and there was no father, and there was a lot of dysfunction going on. One of the things I love about writing, you and I have talked about this, is I love how the writing can lead the writer to places he or she would never have consciously in their minds. And when I wrote this, I wasn't going to write about my family at all. I knew I was writing about fighting and eventually the writing that saved me, but I tried not to write about them because I thought, that's their business. But it was a dishonest draft because I didn't grow up in a vacuum. And one thing I learned was I thought all the rage I had when I was in fistfights after I learned to start fighting back was because I'd been a bullied kid. No, it had to do with, our tough circumstances.
Yeah, we should make it clear you weren't a fighter like Mickey Ward.
No, I wasn't
a boxer. You were like a fighter, but you got really fit and tough, and you were in top shape.
Yeah. I wasn't a boxer. I was a fighter. It just means bars and alleyways and sidewalks whenever I could. I mean, I took it till I was 15. I would take the beatings, and I was terrified, like most people are. Violence is scary. And I was a little kid, and at 15, something happened that made me snap, and I began to fight back, and I fought for about 13 straight years after that.
Now, you say your dad wasn't a deadbeat, but, I mean, come on. You know, even that heartbreaking scene where your little brother Jeb is throwing stones as the car disappears over the horizon, you know, you bum, you bum. I mean, he deserted you guys.
Yeah, but I feel a little protective of him when, yeah, I mean, essentially, yeah, he drove away and that was it. But when somebody divorces, somebody has to leave, you know, sadly. And I think in the 70s, it wasn't just the old man. I think in the 70s, the divorces were much different than they are now. There was no split custody. There were no bedrooms over there for us to sleep in. It was, you know, he'd pick us up on a Sunday, take us out to eat, drop us off. So it really felt like having an uncle in your life instead of someone who was fathering you. You know, could he have done a better job? Yeah. But I have to say, when I was writing this, I wasn't angry at him or my mother, or why would I be angry at her? I felt no self-pity. I really had to live 35 years past those years before I could write about it honestly and fairly without a chip on my shoulder.
Okay, but come on, being honest here again, I mean, something dreadful happened to your father, and you reconnected over that. Describe what happened.
My dad stopped on the highway to help someone who'd been in an accident, and he got run over and ultimately was crippled for life. He had one leg amputated, the other, you know, crushed beyond use.
Somebody else was killed at the scene.
Somebody else was killed at the scene. He actually helped the woman.
He was happy to help people.
Yeah, yeah, because he was, you know, he was a generous, big-hearted man. We thought he was going to die that weekend, but we were able to keep him for another 12 and a half years. He changed quite a bit. He actually said to me more than once, but I have one event in the book where he's sitting there in his wheelchair, which was his home the rest of his life. He said, you know, even knowing what I would lose when I stopped on that highway, I would do it again. I said, Pop, how can you say that? He said, well, because I've learned so much about life being crippled. He would never say physically challenged, by the way. He insisted on calling it crippled because, you know, he's a writer and didn't use euphemisms.
He actually ended up, his last wife, left him in that state, too. She essentially abandoned him. And so he had 2 other children with the third wife.
My lovely half-sisters, Do
you get along with them now?
Oh, yeah. I'm going to see them in New York tomorrow. They're beautiful women in their 20s. They run a Pilates gym. And one's a writer.
Did he feel resentful that she had done that to him?
Yeah, oh, yeah. He had a lot of pain about it. And he wrote beautifully about it in some of his last essays. Yeah, it was a tough time for him, too. Emily, I hadn't thought about it in that way until you just described it that way. Yeah, I hadn't even thought of that.
You ended up going to Bradford College. That's in Maine, right?
No, Bradford's in Bradford, Mass.
Bradford, Mass.
Right across,
okay.
It's defunct now. It's now a Bible college. But for 200 and something years, it was a small liberal arts college.
All right, and your dad was teaching there at the same time.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't coincidence he ended up going there, but you bumped into him. You saw him flirting with with young girls there. I mean, it had to be a weird experience.
What was really weird about it was I realized I didn't really know my dad, that I only had seen him on weekends. And I realized that his world was so much different from ours, that you know, he lived on this beautiful green walled-in campus. You know, he had no money, but it was a idyllic kind of environment. We lived across the river. I lived on a nice street with a nice house, but my mother couldn't afford it, and we were, you know, a block away from really tough neighborhood, and that's where the title came from. I remember I was walking to the student union one day, and one of the rich girls who tended to go to that school pointing me out as, hey, that's Dubus III, look at him, he's such a Townie. And I remember feeling both pride and I was proud, like, that's right. And then I felt, you know, a little minimized and pigeonholed, thinking, does that mean you won't go out with me now? Or
So being called that obviously stuck with you. And now it is more a source of pride.
Yeah, it is more of a source of pride than not, you know. But I guess one of the things I was just trying to semi-consciously explore in this book, Emily, is this whole notion of I've never felt like the blue-collar people I grew up with, and I've never felt like the college-educated people I ended up being. I've always felt like the strange combination of the two. I'm really comfortable with my working-class buddies, and I'm comfortable with my PhD buddies, but I don't feel like I belong to either one of them.
So one of the critics that I was reading, that they said you get a lot of reviews, was trying to make this analogy that one of your father's first novels was The Winter Father, about the father who leaves his family and goes, and this is before he'd actually left your family, and that this was your writing back to him through that story in a sense.
Yeah, you know, I wasn't conscious of that while writing it, but I do know that for years before my dad died, he and I were close. but kind of like drinking buddy, workout partner close. And for years I wanted to tell him, look, I don't think you really understand what it was like for us over there growing up. And I wanted to sit down and have that conversation with him, but then he got crippled, and I didn't want to hurt his feelings. And then I was just working up the courage to confront him again, and he died. And I really think that in some ways this book was the story I would have told him if I'd had the courage and the time to do it.
One of the things I found interesting was, and you said divorce was different in those times, so was the way you raised children, even if the mom and the dad were there. And frankly, there was a lot more drinking that went on back then.
More drinking, more smoking.
Socializing, so the kids, I identified with, you weren't allowed in the room, at certain times.
Cocktail hour.
Neither were we. We couldn't speak during the news, that kind of thing. But the adults always had their time, and now it's just completely different. It's so centric around the children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think to a fault. And I'm one of those parents who probably make my kids the center of the universe too much to a fault. Yeah, we ran wild, didn't we? Remember, they'd open the door, okay, see you in 12 hours. You just go, and you come back in 10 or 12 hours. And
I guess what I was getting at with the question, though, is did drinking play a role in all of kind of the fallout with you?
Yeah, you mean with my parents?
Your parents, yeah.
Yeah, this was the 60s.
There's some wild creative stuff.
This was the
writing.
60s.
I remember the birthday cake story.
Oh, these are young writers and poets and painters, and there was drinking and there was dope, and I think there was probably wife swapping, although I don't have evidence. But I've heard the rumors. It was not, kids were like dogs. Like, that's a cute dog. Is anyone fed them? And it's just what I knew. It's just, I don't feel sorry for myself, but looking back at those years, I don't know how we got through it.
Does anybody in your family dispute anything that you've said?
No, thank God. My younger sister doesn't want to read the book, and I don't blame her. She says that's too bleak a time. She'd rather not go back. But my older sister endorses everything I wrote, which is comforting. And my mother gave me complete permission to write whatever I wanted, which is, I think, remarkably generous of her, and characteristically generous of her, by the way.
Is everybody okay now?
Yeah, and in the last page of the book, I tell the reader what everyone's doing, and it's miraculous how well everyone's doing. Really to the point where I really believe in miracles, that we somehow all got through that, and we're not just doing okay, we're all doing pretty well.
And you do it all without really discrediting your dad at the same time. He's the central villain in a sense, but not really. Well,
Emily, you know what I believe, in writing this book has kind of underscored that belief for me. I think that most people get up out of bed every day determined to do the best they know how with that day. It's not the best we can do. Most of us can do better than we do. But I think most of us do the best we know how. And when I look back at my old man, my father, I think he fathered the best way he knew how. I think he could have done better, and especially as a father of 3 kids myself. But I'm at peace with that.
Right. Andre Dubus III, great book.
Thank you so
Townie,
much.
Thanks for coming. All right, that is it for Greater Boston. Reminder to tune to my radio show at noon tomorrow, 89.7 tomorrow, Accidental Millionaires, helping pro athletes handle their newfound wealth. And on Greater Boston, why sexual assault on female personnel is the military's dirty little secret. That's tomorrow at 7. I'm Emily Rooney. Good night.